Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hao Huang, Assistant Professor of Social Sciences, and welcome to the Illinois Tech Social Sciences Great Problems, Great Minds Seminar Series. For this seminar series, you can submit questions during the webinar by typing in the chat box. We will open the floor to the questions at the end of the webinar. Now I will introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kate O'Neill. Dr. Kate O'Neill is a professor of global environmental governance and the global local politics of waste and recycling in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management, and Associate Dean of Instruction and Student Affairs for the Russell College of Natural Resources at the University of California at Berkeley, and a bachelor degrees in philosophy, political and economics from Oxford University. She is known for her work on global environmental politics and governance in the global political economy of waste. Her recent book, Waste, was published by Polity Press in 2019. She is also the author of Waste Trading Among Rich Nations, Building a New Theory of Environmental Regulation, published by IIT Press in 2000, and the Environment and International Relations, published by Cambridge University Press in 2009 and 2017. She has published her work in journals such as the Annual Review of Environment and Resources, the Annual Review of Political Science, International Studies Review, Public Understanding of Science, Why's Climate Change, and others. Her recent work has been featured on radio shows such as Fresh Air, Here and Now, and Marketplace, and quoted in the Economist and other venues, including The Conversation. She is a former co-editor-in-chief of the MIT Press journal Global Environmental Politics, and has chaired the Environmental Studies section of the International Studies Association. It's very excited to welcome Professor Kate O'Neill.
Well, thanks, Hao. I will share my screen again. Hold on. There we go. It's great to be here and seeing everybody, seeing everybody's screen just about. So I'm going to talk today about my work on global waste, focusing specifically on plastics and plastics recycling and the global governance of plastics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how wastes are global, and then focus particularly on the crisis of plastic scrap as a global commodity, and then talk about some of the new directions in global waste governance. So this is my perspective. I come from the position that all waste is global. This really is a perspective that informs my most recent book, both that waste is global and that it be considered a resource. So, I mean, I've got the book behind me. It's from Polity Press, 2019. And it's written for a very accessible series on waste on different kinds of global resources. So unlike, I think, a lot of the perspectives that people have, which is like what we do, we throw something away, it gets taken away, it gets managed, it gets buried, it gets recycled, or it gets incinerated. But in fact, the better perspective for waste is to understand its value. That what we throw away is not necessarily the end of its life. It has value for the resources it contains or whether it can be refurbished. It often travels the globe, cars, plastics, e-waste, clothes, even food show up in many countries, from other countries in the world. What we throw away provides a livelihood to tens of millions of people around the world who work in waste, either the formal sector, that we're familiar with city waste collection that you'll see all around Chicago, here in the Bay Area, as well as informal waste pickers, people who make a basic living picking through, collecting and sorting and reselling things that other people have thrown away. But it's also true that what we throw away is still piling up everywhere and can still pose major risks through sheer volume or through its hazards and toxicity, as we see in plastics, and the way in which plastic trash has infiltrated the oceans and indeed all levels of the food chain. And just speaking to the piles of waste, our wastes even transcend planetary boundaries. This is just an artist's rendition, as well as a short graph on how much waste is actually floating around us in space, which is, again, quite significant and quite dangerous for both satellites, but also astronauts traveling to and from the International Space Station. And I think no waste crisis right now is more visible than the global plastics waste crisis. Just some brief statistics here that in total, we produce 5 billion metric tons of plastic waste. We put around 8 million tons of plastics into the ocean each year. I believe that number has increased. That's a number from a study a number of years back. Plastics make major contributions to climate change. I've got a slide on that. And basically, our recycling systems, especially in developed countries, are broken. They just simply do not have the capacity to take on the sheer volume and types and conditions of the plastics that we throw away. And also that global markets and recycling markets at home were destroyed when China decided to stop importing plastic scrap. And that's an important part of the story. And I'll get to that in a few slides' time. This slide just indicates, I don't know how well you can see them, but just what happens to plastics around the world. And the two bars that are most important to look at are the green ones. So there you see from plastic production to waste, the teeny proportion that is recycled and the even smaller proportion that is recycled and still in use. One of the big problems with nearly all kinds of plastics, though not all, is that they rarely can be recycled more than once, which is different from, say, metals or other kind, or even paper and cardboard, which are much more easily either evenly recycled or upcycled. And in addition, you can see from all the countries from which plastics enter the ocean, and that's pretty much every country, especially every coastal country, there's measurable flows of plastic waste into the oceans. We're familiar with the macroplastics, the laundry detergent containers, bottles, bags, all of those that are consumer plastics that appear in the oceans, particularly in the Pacific, that have been traced to offloads from Asia, Southeast Asia. We're less familiar with the amount of fishing nets that get discarded from ships at sea, fishing fleets at sea, when they're no longer useful. And that's the largest volume. No, by weight, that's the largest quantity of plastic waste. Also, even from the US, where waste, and other countries where plastic waste is well managed, you still have offloads of things like microplastics, little plastic nanobeads or tiny fragments that come off our polyester clothing or our fleece, our manufactured fleece clothing in the laundry, or tire dust off the road and so on. So we see a lot of plastics from both where it's well managed and mismanaged flowing into the oceans every year. But not only is plastics critical as to deal with as a pollution problem and at the waste end, but also in terms of the entire plastics life cycle. And I'll get back to this because I think this is very significant. The plastics production needs addressing, partly because of the environmental justice implications. The petrochemicals industry, which is, part of the fossil fuel industry, tends to be located in parts of the country and parts of the world where the poorest communities live and where there's the most human health and environmental damage. And then also plastics across its life cycle provides significant greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And that's from production and from incineration and disposal, but we'll see in a little while how that pans out. I think a lot of the a lot of the times I talk about plastics and waste, people focus directly on recycling and waste production, but this slide and a couple of others demonstrate that actually we also need to be looking very much at plastics production and also manufacturing and the role of the plastics industry and the plastic, like the plastic consumer products packaging industries, and pushing greater use of plastics and resisting cutbacks. So this is the event that really got me started on thinking about plastics as a global waste problem. Between 1992 and 2018 or so, China took cumulatively 42% of the world's plastic scrap. Now, this was not something at all well known before 2017, beyond the scrap trade circles. I kind of knew about it because one of my undergraduates had done her senior thesis on where does Berkeley's plastic go, and found out that most of it went to China. So that's 42% of the world's plastic scrap cumulatively. It's a much higher percentage if you look at from the west coast of the United States. Now, China took this scrap to basically feed its own growing industry. It did not produce enough plastic at home that could be reused and could be used in production or recycled to be used again in production. So we took that opportunity to start shipping them the plastics very cheaply. Kind of went, you know, Chinese goods would come to the US, and rather than sending those ships back empty, we sent them back full of scrap. And I will add at this point that China is the leading market too for what I call the good scrap, which is the metals and other kinds of substances that can be, and scrap that can actually be recycled and reused back in more or less its original shape. But China also took plastic scrap and paper scrap from most of the developed countries in the world. Hold on. What's that? Okay, so, oops, sorry. Skipped along there. So on March 1st, 2018, this ended. Something called Operation National Sword from Beijing. This was launched in part to combat the excessive contamination that came with these plastic scrap bales from other countries. We'd gotten sloppy about what we sent and what condition we sent it. Also, China itself was starting to sort of produce its own plastic a little bit more so it could substitute it in. But there's very much this narrative that China has put forth, and that NGOs and other actors in other countries have also picked up on, which is this phrase, no more foreign garbage, that China was very much resisting being seen as a global dumping ground, which has a lot to do, in fact, with China and how it perceives its role on the global stage as the rising superpower. The rising superpower should not be a country that is receiving a lot of trash and recycling it very badly from other countries. Now, just to say a bit about that, China's recycling rates are certainly a lot higher than ours. Ours are like 4% right now. The best estimates I saw were 29% of foreign scrap getting recycled and reused in China, but a lot was disposed. I think also one of the biggest problems is the conditions under which it was being disposed, which were very hazardous to very informal work, very hazardous to the workers and to the environment around it. But this had like a massive impact suddenly on the US recycling industry. The end of recycling as we know it was one of the things that was the quotes that was carried around at the time. And this is really where we found out is what I call in one of my articles, a recycling reckoning, that for 20 years within the US, there'd been very little investment in new recycling infrastructure. We just simply relied on this loophole. And this was also a source of income for local authorities, for recycling companies who, you certainly consumers and customers pay to get your recycling taken away, but that was not enough money to cover it. They were relying on the demand from China to buy that plastic and that additional revenue to come in and help pay for the services that they offer. So the changes were very rapid. I mean, I think this is a really good example of how global events can rapidly affect local events in this situation. Like Beijing made this decision. The next week, you're seeing major shifts in recycling markets. There are some good things that happened, much more public awareness of the plastics problem. that kind of dovetailed with concern about plastics in the oceans. That's been very much with us for a few years now. And you saw policy changes across the US and the industrial world, and the industrialized world. And on the good side, this was more local zero waste initiatives. Zero waste initiatives being when less waste is diverted from going into landfill or towards incineration. So that's recycling and reuse and also reduction, those 3 R's. But also a lot of US local companies, recycling managers cut back their services. They would no longer pick up plastics and also certain other kinds of recyclables. So you had a lot of different things happening at local levels in the US and other places. But you also saw as a loophole for a while that plastics got diverted to other Asian countries. So Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, all of these countries suddenly, often Chinese companies would move across there and start importing plastics to go back to China once they were recycled, or just simply countries jumping in without any kind of infrastructure dealing with this. So that again shifted the problem, and in fact, kind of made it worse. So once this problem of plastic diversion became commonly known globally, these other Asian countries started to refuse imports too. And so, for example, here this is a Malaysian example, in May 2019, they announced that they were going to be sending shipments back to where they came. So this led to a lot of different policy actions at local and global. So this is kind of some of the state level initiatives and corporate initiatives that have happened recently. One is introducing extended producer responsibility, whereby plastic packaging manufacturers and the people who use the packaging have a responsibility, or who ship goods with the packaging have a responsibility to either take it back or to pay for it to be recycled on site. So Maine and Oregon kind of kicked off that law, and then California is trying to pick it up too. So our State Bill 54 here requires all packaging in the state to be recyclable or compostable by 2032. And this is important because it's not just what we produce here, but all the packaging that comes into California from elsewhere. And because California is such a huge economy, this is something that will have knock-on effects across plastic production all over the country, and indeed parts of the world. If everybody has to meet California's conditions, then might as well just take the cost and raise all your packaging to that standard. And then you've got companies like PepsiCo to reduce virgin plastic use across all its brands, not just its drinks, by 50% by 2030. And that's still 50% of PepsiCo plastics is quite a lot, but it's still a significant pledge by a very visible corporation. And one of the things you see, that middle photo over there on the right, is SodaStream, which is now actually owned by Pepsi. And that's a very, what I use as an ecological way to have sparkling water for many years without a huge environmental impact. Now, this is all good because unlike many other countries, I just want to note that federal action in the US is almost non-existent. Nearly every other country has some kind of national law around recycling, even supranational in the case of the European Union. But we have here recycling and waste collection is decided almost jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Some states have standards and rules, but generally it's a huge mess, as we call it. And it's been a little bit disappointing how little waste, recycling, and plastics has appeared in actual federal legislation. For example, the Inflation Reduction Act last year had very little around recycling plastics and waste. So we're trying to change that, but it's been really slow and a little bit surprising. It's actually true that the Trump presidency did more for plastics reduction than the Biden presidency, which I find pretty astounding. So we've shifted. My field is global governance, global environmental governance. So, so we have a lot of local and state level plastic recycling governance, and I can certainly talk more about that in Q&A. But what has also happened quite significantly in recent years is the shift of global waste governance to the global level. And I was saying at the start of, before the talk started, is that this is new. Plastics only recently was thought of as really like a local issue, certainly with cumulative environmental effects, but there was no rationale, no easy rationale for international organizations to say, hey, we need to step in and do something about this. But with the growing realization of plastics in the oceans, with global the realization of the plastic scrap trade, which is ongoing, and the need to deal with that, you have ongoing in a much smaller sense. You've got and just the sheer contribution of plastics to climate change. There's really a lot of demand now for like going to the global level and thinking about how to manage plastics. And so there's a new treaty. There's a lot of activism. Break Free from Plastic Pollution is actually a transnational activist group. And you've got some private sector actors. Circulate Capital there is a investment group that invests, it's a venture capital group that invests in plastics reduction and waste management facilities, waste incineration facilities, and mostly in Southeast Asia. So, but this is one of the earliest examples of plastic waste governance. I talk about it as being very recent. I'll talk about the plastics treaty that is being created right now as I talk, but also this is an area where there's what I call policy diffusion, that policies have been created in one country and other countries have said, hey, that's a good idea, let's do it too. And plastic bag bans are a good example, or restrictions of that. Interestingly, although we tend to think, oh, well, you know, the US or Europe are going to do these things first, plastic bag bans actually popped up in South Asia, first of all. And restrictions, partly Bangladesh is a good example from 2002, because that year they had a ton of flooding, and the floods did not go down quickly at all because plastic bags were clogging the drains. So that prompted some very rapid action from the Bangladeshi government. But since then, we've seen a lot of areas that are parts of the world starting to ban plastic bags or charge fees or just simply restrict their use. But this is not universal, and it's not a process that, it's a process that can be reversed. I point this out in the United States because you have, while you have plastic bag restrictions in the states that you'd suspect, like California and in the Northeast, you have other states, and this number has increased. You see between 2018 and 2020, the number of red states there, which kind of coincides with another way in which states are red, but not entirely actually. These are legislatures that have enacted legislation to stop plastic bag restrictions in jurisdictions. So it's like the Arizona state government saying, hey, Tucson, a liberal city, don't do this. Texas saying, hey, Austin, don't do this. You know, so you've got these sets of laws going on, and that's only increased. And this reflects, as I mentioned earlier, the ongoing power of the plastics industry, and specifically, this is various coalitions that are around grocery bags, plastic shopping, single-use shopping bags. Those producers are particularly active in pushing for these state bans. So that's a problem. And this is being seen globally. In Kenya, which is very famous for a very strict ban on plastics, you've got the global plastics industry pushing the Kenyan government to lift those restrictions. But anyway, so this has been a very important part of global plastics governance, just not very visible if you're looking at international treaties and the role of the United Nations. So this is now shifting up to this very global level. I always take this for granted because I normally talk to global governance classes and in seminars, but most of you are probably aware of the Paris Agreement and maybe other kinds of international treaties. Maybe you've heard of the Convention on Biological Diversity or conventions on chemicals or wildlife. There's hundreds of international environmental treaties, some of which work better than others. The ozone, like the treaty to combat CFCs and ozone depleting substances is the most famous successful example. And we're all familiar with climate treaties and negotiations and how difficult that's been. But so this treaty system is how we deal with environmental problems that are shared across national boundaries, or problems that are in the global commons, like the oceans and outer space. And once we realized that plastics might need to be governed from the global level, and this was about, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, really thinking, well, where can we do this? Because new treaties are really hard to put together. The last one was in 2013, and that was about mercury. And mercury is something pretty much everyone can agree is a bad thing. So NGOs and some governments started looking around and saying, well, what can we do about plastics at the global level? One was to look at oceans agreements. That's the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or the Dumping Convention, to specifically combat oceans plastics. How can we incorporate that? And then there's one waste-related agreement, the Basel Convention on the Hazardous Waste Trade. My next slide, I'll just talk about how that was amended to include restrictions on plastic scrap trade. But what has happened most recently is, again, just last year, although in December 2017, there was like a non-binding resolution to curb plastic waste, and that has now triggered the creation of a new plastics treaty, which is being negotiated right now and is hopefully will be finalized in 2024. But so the first thing that happened was that there's this treaty that has been around since 1989. I know a lot about it because I've been studying the hazardous waste trade for my entire career. And this was all about sort of what you think of as, if you say hazardous waste, you tend to think of what, barrels of sludge or toxic oil or ash, incinerator ash, all of these wastes that are essentially unusable. They really are just toxic dump. Not always, but sometimes. So there are a lot of cases in the 80s of these dumping from rich countries to poor countries, people dying in these communities, a lot of outrage. And that triggered this new convention, the Basel Convention from 1989, to try and stop this. It's not been a very effective treaty. It's kind of weak and took a long while to enter into force. But in 2019, Norway and some other NGOs decided, okay, we really need to stop plastics being shipped around the world, waste plastics being shipped around the world. How can we do this? Well, let's take the Basel Convention and amend it and add plastics to the list of different wastes that can't be traded. Now, this is a tremendous victory. It has a lot of loopholes. The US, for instance, is not a member of this treaty. It makes it easier for the US to actually keep shipping waste. And you've got some resistance. I was at a plastics convention, plastics recycling convention, right, as this was happening, and just hearing the audience, a plastics manufacturers saying, but plastics aren't hazardous. How can you prove that? And it's true, they've not done a very good job of saying actually plastics are hazardous and cannot be traded. They're saying that it must be up to countries to decide. As I said, there are lots of loopholes. Countries can create bilateral agreements to ship wastes amongst each other. And also, partly because of that, international plastic shipments, plastic waste shipments or scrap shipments are very far from over. So you see Latin America and Turkey, Malaysia is still taking some, all of these countries. It sort of goes up and down. This is from about a year ago. Turkey has subsequently said it won't import plastic scrap, but it's still a thing, this trade. And what this means to me is that we're not necessarily, when we're looking at governing plastics as a waste trade issue, we're not necessarily doing this in the right way. We've not necessarily got the right idea, which kind of leads me to a more general discussion of why that's the case. Again, I've studied the waste trade since my PhD, and I've looked at how no matter how many bans you have on shipping waste around the world, they never work. And part of the reason for that is that we kind of have the wrong idea of what the waste trade really is. This whole idea is that it comes from its wealthy countries dumping on southern countries. It's a purely environmental justice issue. It's just being like left there. There's nothing being done with it apart from being burnt and hurting local people. But this is actually not a complete picture at all. This is around e-waste, which is where we've got some of these studies that have been done most clearly. This is purely, don't worry about the numbers or anything. This is purely just kind of to show the really dense network of how how e-waste moves around the world. And you've got arrows and shipments going in all different directions. So this chart and this from the same study shows that we don't have this little simple situation here, that it's very messy, that it's not a north-south problem, that e-waste move around countries from poor to poor countries, from medium income countries to poorer countries, from poor countries to rich countries. It's just a big, complicated mess that a straightforward ban is not going to address. The other thing that we need to think about in terms of waste governance and the waste trade governance is that it's not driven by supply. It's not driven by, oh, we've got a whole bunch of old computers or old plastic we need to get rid of. It's too expensive to do at home. Let's ship it to Africa. It's actually demand. There is demand from these countries for these waste substances, these wastes, which is why we saw China paying for plastic scrap, or entities within China. It was definitely not the Chinese government, and using them. So if we don't understand the fact that there are markets and we need to work with these markets, we're not going to get effective governance. So part of the thing is the governance direction that some people advocate is that we need to recognize that there is demand for refurbished electronics in Ghana, Nigeria, India, other places. We need to figure out ways to make them less dangerous so they can be shipped there safely and recycled and refurbished safely. So that is something that people have brought up as should be a critical piece of how we think about the waste trade. And certainly we need to get beyond that kind of simple dichotomy of north to south shipping and north to south dumping, or rich to poor country dumping. The other thing that's become important is just simply how to make waste work safe. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but over the last few years, it's become really evident that there are that waste picking around the world is huge, and waste pickers themselves, especially from poorer countries, have created these transnational networks. They're becoming very visible. As we do this collecting trash, we sort trash, we recycle, we sell it, we play this absolutely critical role that nobody else does in these cities. And there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of unsafety around how this is done. So again, there are movements globally to push for recognition of waste pickers around the world and to make their position safer, rather than doing what some city governments around the world, like in Rio de Janeiro and Cairo, have just tried to erase these people and replace them with more formal companies from other parts of the world. And that just simply has not worked. And it has had very devastating impacts on these waste workers' lives and livelihoods. So we're still working on, certainly on the trade. And waste work is starting to come up more in, and the big effort right now is this new International Plastics Treaty, which incidentally, as you see in the second bullet point there, actually is bringing waste pickers in and recognizing their role as important in the global economy and in local waste economies as well. So yay, we have this new treaty. And I think it's going to be really interesting as to how it unfolds. It had its first meeting of negotiators in December last year, and there's already a lot of disagreement about whether it should have a narrow focus on end-of-life plastics, plastics going into the ocean, plastics recycling, or whether it should have a much broader scope and try and tackle plastics production globally. Now, that's a very big ambition. But I think people are most immediately concerned about single-use plastics, the straws, the bags, et cetera, that we throw away. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. I think what it's most likely to look like is countries will make their own targets and laws and then register them within this treaty framework. It's like the Paris Agreement does the same thing. Countries set their own targets, and then that is part of the treaty, and they commit within that treaty to report on how they're doing and to strengthen them over time. So that's probably where we're looking. Of course, I can see, lots of problems there, given especially the globalization of the plastics industry, where that might get problematic, but it's a really exciting treaty, and there's a lot of people on board to support it. So that's not about the trade. It's not really treating plastics as waste, but also as a global health hazard, and is considerably more kind of holistic in its scope and maybe tackling the problem from a more effective direction. The other thing is looking at what I was just hinting at, this global green economy, to understand that things that we throw away might actually be the greatest reservoir of resources that we have, especially as other resources. And here you might think about the rare earth metals and other components that go into electronics. We're running low on those. They often come from conflict zones. So mining those can help fund warfare, essentially, in conflict in these parts of the world. So we're also trying to push for a global green economy that focuses beyond plastics and also on electronics. And again, it's become complicated. It's complicated. The right to repair movement is very strong locally in the US as well as globally. And that has to do in the US largely with repairing of electronics. It started actually with farmers in the Midwest who are like realizing that if their tractor broke down in the field, they could not actually fix it because the devices within it were proprietary to the companies that produced it. So essentially they had e-waste on their hands that they could not fix. And you know, farmers trying to fix their machinery is a very fundamental, they're a pretty powerful political constituency. Still, the electronics industry has really fought back because as you probably know, we all have iPhones, we all have laptops. The electronics industry can't keep expanding because everyone is saturated the market with devices. So what it has to do is create churn. So that's why you have something called planned obsolescence. So if your laptop is over 3 years old and has the old operating systems, then you kind of have to get a new one or a new iPhone as they stop updating it, or as devices break and you don't have the right to repair them. So it's a complicated case for this, but I think this would be a very critical thing for the future, as well as thinking about this notion of the circular economy, which is really brings together a lot of what I've been saying about the whole life cycle of plastics and other kinds of products, which is to develop economy-wide or sector-wide policies that lead away from the linear kind of take, make, dispose economy towards having very little waste in the system, to have everything designed well, to have markets for recycling, to create, to encourage people to buy more recycled products, but also to, at a more general level, to create products that last longer or have more components that can be easily recycled. So there you see the circular economy kind of in diagram picture there. The European Union has a much more sophisticated view. Its notion of the circular economy is kind of very big and encompasses their entire economy, including greenhouse gas emissions, chemicals, toxics, food, etc. We tend to think about it more often in the US as the consumer-facing goods, packaging, foodware, textiles, plastic bags, and so on. But again, also trying to think, how do we incorporate the more long-lived plastics that are still a problem? The plastics used in manufacturing cars, appliances, computers, electronics, etc. So how do we start addressing their use? And this is going to be, I think, it's one of the big ideas along with sustainability that's transforming how we talk about plastics policies, waste policies at sort of state levels. Like California is definitely talking about it, and the EU for sure, and other countries, just not the federal government here yet. This actually, I just got today. Sorry, it's a bit of a, not the greatest screenshot. I had to do it quickly. This is yet another reason why we need to be focusing on the entire life cycle of plastics, because you often hear, well, the problem is it's consumers. They're throwing things away. They're not recycling. The recycling industry is broken. You know, that's creating all these problems. And of course, it's really critical for greenhouse gas emissions. We do this too. But this is yet another example about why we need to focus on the upstream in the industry, because I know we see like 61% of greenhouse gas emissions coming and 30 from production and 38 from creating manufacturing products out of those plastics, and only 9% from incineration or landfill and recycling. So this again is yet another reason why we need to think in the bigger picture, in terms of like the entire plastics economy. And that's going to be hard, especially as it's global, especially as the plastics industry is really powerful. On the upside, there are a lot of NGOs, a lot of activists, there's a lot of health activists who are very concerned with it. So, you know, we've got a lot to move forward. We have ongoing challenges, of course. My grad student and I have been doing some work on COVID impacts of waste, and it's been really bad. For one thing, you've got massive quantities of masks and other protective equipment. You also have a lot of instances where cities rolled back rules about plastic bags because they were scared of hygiene impacts. We had a lot more packaging. A lot of this is the plastics industry again saying, hey, you know, we've got to be hygienic. Reusable tote bags are going to spread COVID, and reusable mugs, and actually, you know, there's no reason for these to live on the virus to live on surfaces like other viruses. It does not. So this again, there are always challenges to addressing plastics and pollution, and we kind of have to roll with it and develop systems that are a lot more innovative and predictive of what might happen. So big, complicated problem, lots of efforts to solve it at the local, national, and global levels, different parts of the world. Generally, yes, waste have a global future. I think that we need to maintain thinking about it not as a local problem so much as a problem that has global ramifications. We've got to stop really thinking about end of pipe solutions for waste that, you know, we throw it out and then it goes away. That's not true. But we need to figure out how to govern this new resource frontier, this new source of resources. So waste it's a critical topic. It tells us a lot about the state of the world and the state of global governance, and has some very real impacts on our own lives. It's not as abstract as other global environmental issues, but we're still really figuring out how to move forward in ways that minimize impacts on human health, but also maximize re-extracting resources for important reasons. So I'll shift to questions. These are photos I took just over 3 years ago, right before the shutdown. I went to tour a materials recovery facility, which is where recycling from households gets taken and sorted, repackaged, and shipped on to its next destination. And you can tell I was in Santa Cruz because they had an entire wall of surfboards that people had thrown away that I think they were keeping. So I will stop there and take questions. I don't know if anything's in the chat, but I certainly, let me stop sharing. There's also something else in the chat, and I also see a question on the screen. Thank you for listening to that long presentation. Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you for your great talk. It's definitely give us the new insights about the waste and the recycling. So I think there are quite a few. So currently we open to the questions for Jeff. You want to? Jeff?
Yeah, thank you. Great talk. I guess one question, well, two questions that come to mind. One of the reasons that plastics recycling is so dangerous and hazardous is it's incredibly labor intensive. Is there anything that can be done to reduce the amount of labor? Because I think recycling is always going to be problematic, especially when you have a decreasing labor force. And second, is there any thought of reducing some of the plastic use by going back to glass bottles and glass containers?
Right. Two good questions. One, On the labor side, absolutely. I mean, I think just the statistics about waste workers around the world sort of bear out a lot of those problems. It's an interesting combination of answers, because I think that here at the sorting end, we're definitely moving towards more mechanization, artificial intelligence, to kind of be able to tell what is on the conveyor belts and process it much faster than humans can. And also, again, to make it less dangerous, because clearly we throw away things that are sharp, pointy, whatever, medical waste, and the household level has become more of a problem. So yeah, there's mechanization. Some people worry about that because, again, it takes away jobs, and it can, especially in the global south where people do rely on waste picking, as it's a good source of income. Dangerous and hazardous as it is, it's certainly, when you look at the informal sector, it's got like agriculture and clothing manufacture. The clothing manufacturing, it's often one of the better sources of income. So figuring out how to do that safely and create safer conditions is important. And that's been one of the goals of some of these organizations of waste pickers that I was talking about, is working with cities to create safety training, to create gear, to create recognition of these people as part of the city's economy, and not just kind of people who are just putting themselves in danger, or you know, should be pushed off and pushed away from their work and from the services that they do. So there's a lot of thought being put into that at different levels, but that's definitely, and also just not having people live where they dismantle the waste. I think that's something that's been, China's tried to do with e-wastes, and I think from what I understand, though I don't know, I've never been on the ground, has been able to kind of move people away from the main e-waste dismantling facilities and formalize that, clean it up a little bit. What was your second question?
Jeff?
About glass bottles.
Oh, glass
So,
bottles. Oh,
and I guess I would add into this greater recycling fees. I mean, when I was a boy back in ancient times, you know, there was on glass bottles a 10 cents a bottle deposit. So even if I found three bottles sitting there, you know, I'd be able to buy a Snickers bar. And I think
Yep.
the places that have deposits, you know, now still charge like 5 or 10 cents. I think Michigan still has that. And
California
shouldn't that
has
be
it.
higher now, like $1 a bottle?
Ought to be, shouldn't they? Yeah. No, they're not higher, but they've still, I mean, there's a 5 cent, return value on plastic bottles and cans. That ought to be a lot higher. Yeah, there's conversation about having some kind of bottle bill that also expands it to other kinds of containers and packaging, which would be great. I mean, again, it does create income. I'm with you. I used to certainly be able to supplement my income a lot better as a kid when I had that amount of money. Certainly now that wouldn't help at all. So I do think that's something people are thinking about. I think it's being thought about in California as well. The glass issue is a difficult one because glass is very hard to recycle. In fact, very few parts of the country recycle glass now. And that's partly because partly because it's so heavy and there are so few uses for it that ground down glass, you know, what can you do? Put it in roadways and so on. So that actually was one of the sacrifices when China stopped importing plastics, because glass recycling had effectively been cross-subsidized by the revenue they were collecting from plastics. So people always say, well, we can now recycle glass. That's actually not true. But there is a lot of room for local glass economies. Again, I go back to my childhood. We had bottles of milk delivered on our doorstep, and we put the empty bottles back and they got reused. And we see that with beer, and some, you know, local breweries will do it, and some milk places still, you know, you return to the supermarket. So it's there and it can be done on a local level. And I think that's good. It's hard. It's going to be, again, it's hard to scale up, but it's still, I think that's quite an important contribution that shows a kind of local circular economy. So that's glass. So it's a difficult story. Question.
Yeah, we have a question from the chat box. Is I heard China is moving to a national waste management strategy focused on composting. So isn't it true? Then the second question is also, can you comment on increased reuse and legislation in Europe and challenges around the developing infrastructure for that especially since plastics used for reeusables can have a more intensive LCA if not reused properly.
Yeah. I don't know enough about China's composting strategy. I think that that's the case. It's still more along the lines of biological wastes, plastics, not so much. We just have not, and we really have not developed effective compostable plastics yet, or effectively compostable plastics. It's not easy. So I don't know whether that would connect with the plastics problem at all. I know China has traditionally also relied on incineration as a tool, waste to energy, which kind of connects with, again, one of the solutions that's being put forward here, which is kind of chemical recycling, but that I don't know. Also, right before the pandemic, China was putting in place getting rid of single-use plastics legislation. I have no idea of the status of that. So China is this really interesting case of like laboratories for practices, but also still a large source of pollution. Infrastructure for reuse legislation. Yes, that is something that the Europeans have been doing for a while. One of the examples is to reuse components, a reuse of components requirement for large appliances. Can that? What it needs, I think Europe is better at this than we are, which is creating those manufacturing facilities to do that. It is not easy. This is not just substitution or taking the part and putting it back into the production cycle. You actually need better technology for, say, reinserting chips back into a cell phone or into a computer, or you know, computers or components back into cars and fridges. It's not easy. Yeah, this is something that I haven't researched directly, but people do worry about plastics being very hard to recycle and very energy intensive to recycle, especially if you're really trying to get it back to hard plastics, to that reusable form. That's been a real challenge. And again, that's why you're starting to see people focusing on chemical recycling that can actually much more easily reduce the polymers back to the monomers, but again, very energy intensive. So, and a lot of opposition on various potential grounds to doing that. I've had a request for the recording to be shared. So
yeah, so yeah, we have the recording. We'll share by the web page. So I will send the link at the end. So the other question is, I have the perception that the recycling is the least effective process out of reducing and reusing. So which is evident in corporations advocating for these principles, since this process can be outsourced as you discussed here. So what can be done to encourage more reuse of plastic products, considering this is more expensive option?
Mm-hmm. So is that plastic products, the reuse being more expensive or the recycling? But it is, yeah, recycling, reducing and reusing typically, yes, recycling. A lot of people say recycling is a waste of time. We shouldn't even bother doing it. And doing it is just creating more of a problem because people feel like they have a way out and continue using plastics. That's not entirely true. Certainly for good quality plastics, there is a very strong market for those, especially as these companies start increasing their pledges for recycled content. So I don't encourage people to stop doing it, although I do encourage people to try and hold local authorities to task for actually getting it done. I know Chicago has a particularly bad record globally with recycling. But yes, encouraging reuse of plastic products, but also switching them out. Again, things like reusable mugs are really good to carry around, or bottles. And I see more and more people doing that. And that's a very visible source of change. I love the fact that there's so many reusables. Your water fountains everywhere now where you can refill your bottles. So that's been super helpful. So that is where I would focus action on, is switching out single use to multiple use products. And more reuse of plastic products that you have. I recommend if you can, but I say still cutting back on what you use and trying to use reusables whenever possible is most helpful.
Matt?
Sorry. I just want to do a follow-up question. Sorry. What I mean by reusing plastics, I mean like the companies reusing their own bottles.
Oh, yeah. Yes. So taking it back and reusing it themselves. I think that's not quite how the markets work directly, but that plastics will then get sold off by the MRF or whoever's responsible to somewhere else that will use it. So, but I remember in the talk I mentioned extended producer responsibility. And this is actually, I think, what you're getting at, which is ways to make companies really responsible for their own plastics and taking them back. We do that with electronics. We do that actually most effectively with mattresses. When we buy a new mattress, the company takes back the old one for a small fee and is supposed to get rid of it safely. And that's an effective way of working. So yeah, we are trying to build extended producer responsibility for plastics. So that can be that they directly have to take back the packaging and reuse it or recycle it. And that in turn gives them more of an incentive to switch out to cheaper, more better packaging that can be used more often. So that's a really good idea. It's hard. You've got to be able to have transparency and ways to monitor and verify that that's actually being done. So that's important. Or you have systems where the new Maine and Oregon laws that I mentioned, where the companies, instead of taking it back directly, pay into a recycling fund to recycle it better. I personally quite like the idea of them just having to take it back because it's very visible and very physical, rather than, oh, we'll just pay some money and it'll vanish off into this fund that we hope is going to be used for this purpose. So yes, so that's actually a way that a lot of people are trying to think about reducing packaging in particular.
I had a question. Thanks so much, first of all, for coming out. I thought it was just really interesting, and you touched on so many different things. The first question is if you could just provide a clear answer to whether you think, I mean, because you talked about supply factors and demand features, but which of those factors are, in your mind, more important? Addressing issues related to the supply of plastic, or on the demand side, sort of getting to the point that Jeff made earlier regarding the bottle bill, or what Marjorie Isaacson put in the chat about the bottle bill that we're dealing with here in Illinois, or something like a pay-as-you-throw system, where we're paying for the amount of garbage we have, that would sort of motivate that kind of demand side factor. So I just want you to, just tell us what you think about those, supply or demand, or both. And then also, if you could touch on any of the strongest political factors that play a role in all of this, not at the national level so much, but like, what are the key, I guess the key players, who are they, and what are they doing? And I know we're almost out of time, so I guess you have 30 seconds.
A couple of big questions. Well, let's see. So yeah, recycling. I think that I can say this fairly straightforwardly, that no matter what technology we have for recycling or how much we think of it as a virtue and something we should be doing. If there aren't markets for what's recycled, afterwards the whole system collapses. And that's what we saw when China reduced, cut back and stopped importing plastic scrap from us. So I think that what really drives recycling systems is demand for the recycled product. And that's true. If we don't have those markets, then it's just not going to happen. Stuff is going to pile up. And that's what we need to work on. And sometimes that's really, you know, getting the companies like Pepsi to take back to use secondary plastics. It's often even at a basic level, when I say recycled toilet paper, people, but what I mean is, you know, toilet paper made out of recycled paper and creating those markets, but also just having people creating those incentives. And sometimes with plastics, it's difficult because when prices of oil are low, virgin plastic is a lot cheaper than recycled plastic. So that again, markets are very, very volatile for recycled goods. So it's hard to maintain that without some kind of supportive markets. So that's a high level answer to your question, but hopefully it's one that you can apply. And actors, I would say that a lot of civil society organizations, NGOs, and not-for-profits are really good advocates and very vocal. Actual local recyclers are pretty, like the companies that pick up, especially if they're smaller companies in your areas that pick up your trash, are very strong advocates. So I'll just sort of, I guess, finish up by having been around a table with a lot of people who run these small companies, recycling companies, just head in hand about what they can do to improve recycling, but having some good solutions. Because they're on the ground, like how do you educate consumers? How do you create more effective pickup? How do you, whether you have multiple bins or just one bin for all the recycling. So you have those are the people who I think are not listened to enough, who have the real expertise on the streets and also have a very sophisticated understanding of the markets for where it gets sold off to. My favorite bin, apart from the surfboards in that Santa Cruz facility, was a bin of like yogurt cups that have been cleaned out. And she's like, well, someone's going to come along and buy them, the woman who was running it eventually. So I'm keeping it just in case. So I feel like there's that expertise that is definitely underplayed. The people that really know what's going on and are advocates for recycling and for a greener economy.
Do you have time to take more questions?
I can take one more. I've got a thing at noon my time.
So Jonathan is not here, but he left questions. Is like, what lessons have we learned from the Belsen and Bamako conventions that might be applied to an international convention on plastics? Ideally, would it be preferable to expand and strengthen those conventions instead of creating a new one?
Yes, I think that's one of the things, the sort of high level takeaways again from this talk, which would be that yes and no. I mean, partly I think it's good to incorporate lots of different issues into conventions. It's just that I don't think the waste trade restrictions are the right place, the hazardous waste trade restrictions, because there's too many ways to get around them and too many ways in which you can't really say plastics is directly hazardous yet in the same way that you can talk about like toxic sludge. So I think creating the standalone treaty will be a more effective and visible route. But I do think, there are ways in which you can talk about plastics in so many treaties. And maybe it's good to incorporate it in Law of the Sea and biodiversity and the chemicals conventions. So I think we're really just kind of seeing the scope, the wide scope of action we have for dealing with plastics at the global level. But again, that always comes down to how effectively are we implementing these laws.
Okay, thank you so much. Usually we give a great applause to the speakers, give as a great talk. Actually, I have quite more questions, but I will probably send you emails for those questions. It's very interesting talk. So also I put the link for these recordings because some audience ask for the recordings links. So put it in the chat box. So thank you so much for this fascinating talk. So
Thank you. Thank you for your interest and your questions and giving me some other things to look into.
yeah, thank you so
Illinois,
much.
dollar
Yeah.
bills.